So welcome everybody, welcome Christine to the seminar. So Christine, let's see if I can do this right. Beyzaei?
Yeah, Beyzaei, that's right.
From somebody who has a challenging last name, I've met my match. So welcome and thank you very much for agreeing to give us this webinar. Christine has an undergraduate degree from George Washington and then master's and PhD from Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. I know she's been involved in a lot of gear missions and reconnaissance missions, so she's very lucky to have been on some of those more exciting opportunities to see the results firsthand and very quickly after the event. I know she's very involved in committee work and also very involved in education outreach, especially to young up-and-coming scientists, which is really appreciated. And so it sounds like a fantastic resume you sent us, and we're really looking forward to your talk. So thanks again for agreeing to do this for us.
Sure. Thanks, John. Thank you guys for having me. Really excited to share all this with everyone today. Oh, okay. I am now the presenter. Okay. Can everyone see the slides? Yes.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, looks good. Okay, great. So yes, thanks again for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining today. I'll be discussing liquefaction effects at silty soil sites through case histories from Christchurch, New Zealand. And the work being presented today was part of a much broader research effort by the team listed below, and was supported by many agencies and organizations, both in the US and in New Zealand. And I'd especially like to acknowledge my advisor for my PhD work at UC Berkeley, John Bray, as well as Mieszko Kubernovsky, who was my host faculty for my time at the University of Canterbury doing laboratory testing. So as you're probably aware, during the 2010-2011 Canterbury earthquake sequence, liquefaction damage devastated the city of Christchurch, New Zealand. And at many sites throughout Christchurch, our state of practice methods indicated that liquefaction would be expected. And indeed, during post-earthquake reconnaissance, liquefaction was observed, such as at the site shown here. However, there were also many sites, predominantly silty soil sites, where our state of practice methods indicated that liquefaction would be expected. But during post-earthquake reconnaissance, no surface manifestations of liquefaction were observed, such as at the site shown here. So it was really this discrepancy between our state of practice liquefaction estimations and post-earthquake observations that led to the development of the research and case histories I'll be discussing today. So the state of practice liquefaction assessment procedures used today, they're empirically based and they've all been built on underlying case histories. These have typically focused on clean sand sites, and laboratory testing has also tended to focus on sands. So the silty soil sites we're discussing today really do differ from a majority of the case history database. As an example, we can look at the Boulanger and Idris 2014 CPT-based method, where out of 253 cases, less than 15% of these cases had soil with fines content greater than 35%. It's also important to note that because the case histories have been developed based on post-earthquake observations, liquefaction triggering is implicitly paired with surface manifestations. So the case histories we're discussing today essentially work towards filling two gaps in our empirical data sets, one being that they're, quote, no liquefaction sites, and also that they're silty soil sites. The Canterbury earthquake sequence has given us an unprecedented opportunity to evaluate our current liquefaction assessment procedures and develop additional case histories. It consists of the four main events shown here, and afterwards there was extensive documentation of post-earthquake observations throughout the Christchurch region. And in addition to those post-earthquake observations, there's also been extensive subsurface investigation. So a very unique data set from the Canterbury earthquake sequence. Today we'll be focusing on observations from the 2011 Christchurch earthquake, which caused severe and pervasive liquefaction throughout Christchurch, as indicated by the orange and yellow colors shown here. So the most severe damage was in the eastern suburbs along the Avon River. However, throughout much of southwestern Christchurch, in this area here, no liquefaction manifestations were observed, despite state of practice methods indicating that at many of these sites, liquefaction would be expected. So this is the area where we focused our study. We selected 6 silty soil sites, shown here, throughout Southwest Christchurch for more in-depth investigations, as well as 3 clean sand sites from along the Avon River that we could use as a point of comparison for our investigations at the silty soil sites. So at these sand sites, our state of practice methods indicated liquefaction would be expected. Post-earthquake reconnaissance, liquefaction was observed, so this serves as our point of comparison. I'd also like to emphasize here that we selected 6 sites. However, we began with a candidate pool of more than 30 potential sites. And Tonkin and Taylor went through a quite extensive preliminary investigation analysis program so that we could screen this initial candidate pool and remove sites that had easily identifiable reasons for why liquefaction wasn't observed, so that when we put in the effort to do these in-depth investigations, we're looking at sites that have the potential to be more meaningful case histories for advancing the field. So what I'm showing here are CPT profiles for the 6 silty soil sites and 1 clean sand site for comparison, which is here. These are silt dominant profiles, and as we move from left to right, we move closer to the typical liquefaction profile on the right. 5 out of 6 of these sites had no liquefaction observed during the Christchurch event, whereas one of the silty soil sites, this one, which we interpreted as being closest to a typical clean sand site, did exhibit liquefaction during the Christchurch event, but not during the Darfield event. So this represents more of a marginal case history and could perhaps be very useful in helping to define the triggering curves. So with these sites, we have a set of locations that are not well represented in the empirical data sets. They're not well captured by our available methods, and we also don't really have anything at the ground surface, no surface evidence of liquefaction. So how do we investigate these sites? Our goal with this research was to do what we could to understand the discrepancy between the state of practice procedures and post-earthquake observations. So we began by conducting field sampling and laboratory testing of these silty soils to assess their seismic response and resistance, as well as evaluate the possibility for other contributing factors. In going through this research program, we also were developing these case histories for integration in the Next Generation Liquefaction dataset. So it's really exciting to be here today with potential users of this data. And in addition to that, we're working with our industry partners in Christchurch to provide additional guidance on evaluating the seismic response of these soils for practicing engineers during the rebuild and in other similar regions around the world. Our field investigations began in 2014 with a preliminary site characterization and cyclic triaxial testing at 8 sites. So we did sonic borings, CPTs, cross-hole seismic testing, which was performed by UT Austin, Ken Stokey, and Brady Cox, and high-quality sampling so that we could obtain specimens for laboratory testing. In 2016, based on the results of our 2014 investigation, we were able to return to 3 sites and do an in-depth site characterization and detailed logging, again using high-quality sampling, but this time for the purpose of logging, and doing mini-CPTs for comparison with our initial investigation using conventional CPTs. High-quality sampling was performed to obtain, like I said, quote, undisturbed samples. We advanced cased mud rotary borings with a track rig and used a side discharge tricone roller bit. We used the Dames and Moore sampling device, which is a hydraulic fixed piston sampler, and we utilized thin-walled constant diameter brass sample tubes to reduce disturbance. If we obtain 100% recovery, that corresponds to a 45 centimeter sample length, which allows us to obtain 2 specimens for cyclic testing. Cyclic testing was conducted at the University of Canterbury laboratory using the device shown in this photo, which we brought over from California and assembled on site. We performed our testing at 1 second and 10 second periods and had a typical specimen height to diameter ratio of 2 to 1. So what I'm showing here are sort of representative results from our cyclic triaxial testing program. And in looking at the results of our cyclic triaxial testing, we were evaluating axial strain development versus number of cycles, looking at multiple criteria to establish cyclic resistance curves for each site. And from these resistance curves, we would then be able to develop laboratory-based estimates of cyclic resistance for these soils. In addition to our cyclic testing program, we of course performed a conventional laboratory testing program to obtain particle size distributions, Atterberg limits, specific gravity, Emax, Emin, so that we would really have as much data as possible on these specimens. For particle size distributions, we primarily used laser diffraction analysis. However, we did do some sieve hydrometer tests. And for Atterberg limits, we did employ both the Casa Grande cup and the fall cone. We were interested in looking at the particle size and shape for these silty soils. In Christchurch, the sands tend to be quite fine, to very fine, especially at these sites. So we're really looking at soils that are on this sort of borderline, and given the shape of the distribution, small shifts one way or the other could result in large differences in the estimated fines content simply because of where they fall on that line. We're also interested in particle shape, and what I'm showing here on the right are SEM photographs that we took because a lot of the reference sands might be larger particles, more rounded particles. And so this is Monterey 030, and these are all at the same magnification. So this is Monterey 030, which is a reference sand we use in our calibration and some of our initial testing. And for comparison is shown with some of this soil from our silty soil site. So this photo here is from a site that had 10% fines content. So definitely it was one of our sandier sites. And then here is from a specimen that had fines content of around 60%, I believe. And this has been separated into the coarse and fine fraction. So you can see that compared to the Monterey 030, we're dealing with smaller, more angular particles. I mentioned that we used hydrometer testing and laser diffraction testing. And this is important to note, especially if you'll be a user of the data that's in the database. The laser diffraction data provides us with more of an essentially continuous curve. I think typically there's 100 data points that come out of that, whereas the hydrometer data, of course, is at these discrete points. We did notice in the comparisons that the laser diffraction data tended to have a tail that was more closely tied down to 0 at the end as compared with our more standard hydrometer data. In looking at all of our laboratory testing data for the different sites, we weren't ever able to come up with a clearly identifiable trend for, comparing the two. But the main difference seemed to be occurring at this tail, but I just wanted to highlight that for people who might be using that data. I mentioned that we did sampling at these sites, we are targeting shallow alluvial soils. So I think all of our sampling took place in the 0 to 7 meters below ground surface. And so when we're dealing with natural specimens, it's great because we're getting what's actually in the ground, but it can also be quite challenging in that you're essentially stuck with what comes up out of the ground. So what I'm showing here are 2 specimens, one sand, one silt, and I would consider these good specimens. They relatively homogeneous, there are no voids, no cracks. For comparison, these are examples of not so great specimens. So obviously these were not tested. And you can see here this specimen, because it's so shallow, it has a void from a root. And this specimen, given the environment in Christchurch, we had essentially cored through a tree trunk at that location. So these are obvious candidates not to be tested. However, the majority of our specimens fall somewhere in between. And with dealing with these types of soils, especially in a layered environment like this, with natural specimens, there's going to be, inherent differences in the samples that you take. So a large part of our testing interpretation was looking at the samples that we had obtained, looking at the CPT data, boring logs, index testing, so that we could effectively group different specimens together to come up with our cyclic resistance curve that would be representative of that layer. So yes, we went through testing at these 6 sites, developed our cyclic resistance curves that would allow us to come up with an estimate of laboratory-based cyclic resistance. And we, of course, applied a lab-to-field correction, taking into account the correction from triax to simple shear and to multi-directional shaking in the field, so that we could apply that correction factor before comparing our data with the state of practice estimates. So we wanted to do this comparison to see, is our laboratory testing showing resistance that far exceeds what's indicated by the state of practice methods? Because if that were the case, then that is a clear reason for, we misestimated, or the methods don't correctly estimate the resistance, so laboratory testing effectively solves the problem. However, when we did this comparison using Boulanger and Idris 2014 for our preliminary comparisons, we saw that our estimate of cyclic resistance from our laboratory testing was about 0.19, and comparing that with CRR from our state of practice method, 0.16, all things considered, these are relatively comparable values. So our laboratory testing did not show significantly more resistance than our state of practice methods estimate. And again, both estimates of CRR are well below the estimated CSR that we have from our state of practice methods. So our laboratory testing would have had to show twice as much resistance, essentially to get to a factor of safety of 1 to show why these sites may not have liquefied. An interesting finding from the cyclic triax testing program was also in observed differences for post-liquefaction reconsolidation response. In looking at the non-plastic and very low plasticity silty soils, we saw that those demonstrated near immediate reconsolidation, as is typically observed with clean sands. However, even getting into PIs of around 4 to 5, we began to observe a time-dependent reconsolidation response. And this, of course, will have direct implications for in situ field response and the potential for hydraulic connectivity and ejecta formation and settlement. So in thinking about how we might explain this over prediction or apparent discrepancy, we looked at many different factors. We did the laboratory testing program. We also looked at groundwater table fluctuation, potential overlying non-liquefiable crust. A lot of these silty soil sites have a highly stratified subsurface profile, which might lead to at-depth suppression of ejecta movement, compounded with reconsolidation time dependency. And as I mentioned before, these are very angular particles and they're borderline soil types, which again might also be compounded with the inherent conservatism in our analysis approach. So looking at our laboratory testing data, looking at all the factors above, we began to think maybe some kind of combination of all of the above. And similarly to these sites, I believe researchers at other sites throughout Christchurch in the Woolston suburbs, Boulanger, and I think Brady Cox at maybe St. Teresa's School have found similar findings where no single factor explains the discrepancy at these sites. So we have to think about the scale of the problem. And instead of thinking about the element or specimen or particle level response, we want to think about the macro scale, about the system response. So we took a step back and wanted to look at the bigger picture and really utilize the wealth of data that's available from the New Zealand Geotechnical Database. So we began by looking at the depositional environment throughout Southwest Christchurch. And if you're not intimately familiar, the red box shown here is blown up here, and I'm highlighting the central business district in Christchurch, and then this is sort of the southwest area where our sites were located. So we're to the north of the Port Hills, south of the Waimakariri River, and we looked at historical maps, geologic maps, geomorphology, photos, and the detailed logging program that I'll be discussing shortly. So in looking at historical maps of Christchurch, it became clear that the silty soil sites with no surface manifestations of liquefaction were in or adjacent to what had been identified as swamp zones, while the silty soil site that did show liquefaction manifestations for the Christchurch event was far from a siltback swamp in all directions. So to assess and quantify this effect on the regional scale, we compared land damage observations, shown here, with LSN estimates throughout Christchurch, shown here. And LSN is liquefaction severity number. It's an index similar to LTI that was developed specifically based on the Christchurch dataset. And because of the wealth of data in the New Zealand Geotechnical Database, we were able to interpolate over 25 by 25 meter tiles, which was so that we could do a direct comparison and to also avoid CPT density bias in some of the areas that were more heavily investigated. The areas with severe damage were also some of the more populated areas, so there were much more dense investigations in those areas as opposed to some of the outer suburbs, which tended to be perhaps a bit more spaced out. So recognizing the differing depositional environments throughout the Christchurch area with the coastal eastern suburbs, the inland western suburbs, we looked at all areas outside of these identified swamp zones. And then we also looked at the eastern swamp zones and the western swamp zones. And higher LSN should indicate more observed damage. So blue is no ejecta observed, green is minor ejecta observed, and red is moderate to severe ejecta observed. And we should see, as LSN increases, the distribution shifting from blue to green to red as it moves towards higher LSN. And in the areas outside of swamp zones, in the eastern swamp zones, we do generally see those trends. However, in the western swamp areas, we see two things. One, that the green and the blue distributions, there's no real differentiation between those. And additionally, everything is plotting, we're estimating LSNs in the range of about 15 to 35, which corresponds to an expectation that we would have seen some sort of damage. I believe Shord, Van Balgoy, and others have found that at LSN greater than approximately 16 is when, for the Christchurch dataset, that typically corresponds to observed liquefaction damage. So at these sites, we're above that range, but nothing was observed. To give you an idea of the CPT profiles that correspond to those different swamp zones, in the southwestern swamp areas, we see a much more silt dominant profile, as compared with the eastern identified swamp zone in Burwood, which is a much sandier profile, primarily sand. So as we know, geology is important and depositional environment matters. And in this case, it was able to capture some effects that were missed by the simplified methods that manifest as thin layer stratigraphy at a lot of these sites, groundwater table effects. And the importance of geology has been recognized previously, going back to some of the earliest publications for liquefaction assessment, but it is still not directly considered in our simplified methods. The conventional methods are largely based on clean sand deposits, non-plastic silty sands, and thus these interbedded silty deposits with some plasticity are not well captured. And what's really important, I think, for the Christchurch data set is that we have so much data from this event and similarly available from other events following recent reconnaissance efforts that allows quantification of these effects. So, prior to these events, we might only have one boring, one CPT, and things were spread out over large areas, so it was very hard to connect the dots. But with these types of large data sets, it really allows us to begin doing region-wide assessments. After doing the regional assessment, we wanted to look at a site-specific comparison. So we were comparing two sites, one of which was in one of those swamp zones and another which we had identified as being outside of that swamp zone. And Site 33 exhibited no liquefaction following the Christchurch event, whereas Site 14 did exhibit liquefaction. And these have similar subsurface profiles, they have similar liquefaction assessment results, and so at first glance, there's no clear indication for the cause of the differences in these post-earthquake liquefaction observations. However, when we look more in depth at the detailed logging, we very easily see clear differences in stratigraphy resulting from the differences in depositional environment, with the swamp site showing silt seams and layering, which will of course impact the potential for hydraulic connectivity and ejecta formation, as compared to the site 14, more consistent silty sand matrix that would allow formation of a consistent layer or cohesive layer with upward migration of ejecta. So after looking at our regional assessment, our site-specific comparison, it became clear that our conventional methods really weren't capturing all the details that we needed to be able to fully understand these sites. So we went back for additional investigations so that with thin layer stratigraphy, we would have sonic boring, standard CPT, and mini-CPT, our high-quality sampling. And to assess groundwater table effects, we wanted to look at as many sources of data as possible. So we looked at our sonic borings, piezometers, cross-hole testing, which was performed by UT Austin, and again, our high-quality sampling. And in developing these no liquefaction case histories, it was really important for us to fully characterize these site conditions before applying any sort of a priori simplifications based on our whatever thoughts we might have had. We didn't, in developing no liquefaction case histories, we didn't want to miss something that might end up being important for the story at these sites. So to look at thin layer stratigraphy, you can see here we're comparing sonic borings with high quality sampling. And sonic borings are useful for general characterization and bulk sampling, but they cause significant disturbance to soil cores. So for liquefaction assessment or any kind of detailed characterization or wanting to grab samples for fines content testing, this leads to oftentimes significantly disturbed cores in these types of materials. And when you compare that with the high quality sample here, and this red circle is, it's showing the same depth that this sample was taken over, you can see that the difference, I mean, there's no comparison. Basically, all the detail is lost here. So we also, after looking at sonic boring versus high quality sample, wanted to look at CPT and mini-CPT. And we utilized a 10 centimeter square conventional CPT and a 5 centimeter square mini-CPT. We looked at a couple different options for mini-CPT, but given the desire to actually push this in a real world setting and knowing some of the conditions in the shallow Christchurch environment, going smaller than a 5 centimeter square cone wasn't really feasible, in addition to some of the smaller cones not having the full suite of instrumentation that we wanted. So the thought with this was that a mini-CPT smaller diameter cone would be able to pick up additional resolution on some of these thin layers. However, the zone of influence for the mini-CPT was still at a scale that was much larger than the thin layers at these sites. So while we were able to pick up some additional resolution in these cones, it was not enough. It wasn't able to capture as much as we were hoping. So now looking at all investigation techniques combined, you can see here we're comparing conventional CPT, mini-CPT, the sample photograph from our high quality samples, the graphic log, which was developed through detailed logging in the lab, and then the sonic boring core sample. And I think what this is showing us is that our current standard investigation techniques really are missing a lot of the details that might be important for understanding the response at these sites and at others. Something else we looked at as part of our detailed logging program was the fines content I sub C correlation. And this is an important part of CPT-based evaluations. And typically you would obtain a sample and maybe it would be a bulk sample, and maybe your boring and CPT might be spaced a little far apart. So what we wanted to do with this testing program, because we were using a very closely spaced array of CPTs, borings, cross-hole testing, we wanted to look at this issue because our samples were taken from in situ locations that were closely spaced, which would minimize the impacts of spatial variability in this environment. And by taking subsamples from our dames and Moore tubes, we were able to take depth tracked subsamples. So these were very closely depth tracked. So In the Dames and Moore tubes, we were able to identify and say, okay, these layers are different. We want to extract them and get do our fines content and Atterberg testing at, say, just over a 2 centimeter, depth. And in looking at this data, this should not be a surprise to anyone that there's a significant scatter to this data set. And it's not necessarily an issue of the correlation needing to be refined, as much as the CPT itself just isn't able to capture these intricate layers. So when you're doing this comparison, you have the CPT that's smearing over layers, and then you also may, in reality, be taking a bulk sample that possibly has combined some of the sublayers. And so it's no surprise that we have a lot of scatter in this correlation, and perhaps is indicating that we need to think about sort of a more holistic approach to this. So to consider groundwater table effects, we wanted to look at multiple techniques to obtain a robust understanding of groundwater conditions at each site. We were fortunate to be working with the team at Tonkin and Taylor, and they had developed a really great regional groundwater model, which is publicly available. It's in the New Zealand Geotechnical Database, and that model was developed to come up with estimates of the groundwater table at sites throughout Christchurch at the times of these various events. So in addition to that, which allowed us to estimate groundwater conditions at the time of the event, we also could estimate groundwater conditions from sonic borings, continuous sampling based on depth of iron staining. We had the cross-hole seismic testing P-wave velocities that were obtained by UT Austin, which might give indication of partially saturated zones. And we also had the piezometer data from the New Zealand Geotechnical Database that covered a several-year period from which we could use to look at what the sort of maximum and minimums of groundwater table fluctuation at a site would be. So at these case history sites, we looked at all of the different techniques, including stratigraphy investigation, P-wave piezometers, so that as we were looking not just at the estimated groundwater at the time of the event, but also the possible zones of fluctuation, so we could really obtain a full picture and get a better idea about, okay, if it was only saturated down to here, was the crust really thicker, that kind of thing. So how does all of this relate to the tools that we're currently using and have available in practice? It touches on a lot of different areas. So in investigating these no liquefaction sites, the work that we've done relates to triggering procedures and the various corrections, most relevant being the thin layer corrections, settlement estimates, and surface manifestations, and the different available methods that sort of fall under each of those categories. And we should be utilizing all these tools that are available, but we also need to think about if they're appropriate and should be employed in the analysis at a site. A lot of them were developed for different conditions than we had at these sites, and so we really are applying them sort of beyond what they were developed for. So the silty soil sites that we've been discussing today, it's important to note that they're in areas that are not well constrained by the empirical procedures. So for the thin layer corrections, I've highlighted here 0 to 250 millimeters, and a lot of our thin layers were actually quite thinner than this, which is already at the bounds of sort of where these curves are. Similarly, for surface manifestations, we're down here at the bottom of the curves, and at these sites, and at many similar sites, we're not dealing with a single unliquefiable surface layer overlying liquefiable sand. We have interlayers, we have interlayered soils, and so it becomes difficult to then interpret that and say, you know, how are we grouping these things? How are we adding them up so that we can try to apply the existing methods we have? So I think all of this underscores the importance of putting in the effort to develop these case histories, as well as analyzing these case histories and implementing them in the empirical databases so that future efforts, like through the NGL database, we'll be able to use this data, which we know is from sites that are sort of outside the case history data set from which the available methods were developed, to move these methods forward. So brief conclusions. Looking at depositional environment did help us understand whether or not our site conforms to these more typical clean sand liquefaction methodologies. And appropriate site characterization, going through the effort of the detailed logging, allowed for a deeper understanding of site conditions. Laboratory testing is really useful to target critical layers once site characterization has been established, but the cyclic response of silty soils is extremely nuanced and difficult to broadly categorize. I think it's also important to note that these were free field silty soil sites with, free field conditions or light one-story structures on top of them. That could potentially have shown liquefaction manifestations if large buildings were present or if they'd been shaken harder. And finally, as I touched on before, understanding system response is key, and Mishko Kubernovsky has a great paper out on this from 2019. So to sum up for the NGL people on this call, the case history data that's available from these sites, they're silty soil sites with no surface manifestations of liquefaction. We have post-earthquake field observations and aerial photos. We have ground motion estimates from Bradley and Hughes, 2012. We have field data in the form of sonic borings, CPTs, mini-CPTs, high-quality samples, groundwater data spanning several years, and VSVP testing from UT Austin. We also have laboratory data from cyclic triaxial testing, post-liquefaction reconsolidation, Atterberg limits, Emax, Emin, GS, as well as particle size distributions. And we have the detailed logging that was performed by a geotechnical engineer and myself and an engineering geologist, Sarah Baston, when she was at University of Canterbury. I believe she's now at Becca in Christchurch. And we also have depth-tracked subsample laboratory testing data for those continuous high-quality samples. So hopefully all of this can be taken together to move us towards consideration of the many interrelated factors that affect performance at these types of sites. And although my PhD and part of this research has concluded, the work is still ongoing, and one of John Bray's current students, Zorana Mijic, is continuing the investigations at these sites. And she went back to, don't remember how many, she went back to a couple of sites and performed the same type of Dames and Moore sampling and is doing cyclic simple shear testing to add to this data set. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you everyone for attending and for listening. I'd just like to thank again the many agencies that supported this research and my time in the doctoral program at UC Berkeley, which is where this research was conducted. And I'd like to end on a slide from one of my favorite hikes in New Zealand, because I did spend the vast majority of the time in the lab, but also managed to get out for a couple of hikes, and traveling and the South Island does not disappoint. So with that, that's it for me.
Christine, that was great.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christine. That was wonderful. Yep. I just want to remind anyone who's listening in, you're welcome to submit a question through the Q&A, or if you would like to ask your question verbally, I can unmute you if you raise your hand. So if you hover over your name in the attendees list, you should be able to do that. So let's open it up for any questions.
I'm going to take prerogative and ask. So I'm going to take prerogative and ask a question. Okay. Christine, and I'm not a liquefaction expert. I'm a geologist by training. So one of the things I noticed in your early slides, in addition to the very angular grains, is that those grains were also had really high surface roughness. Did you guys ever consider surface roughness in addition to the angularity?
We did not get that far into that topic. No, that would be an area for future research for sure.
Thanks.
John, is John Bray on the line? If he is, Zorana might be looking at that. as part of the follow-on research.
John's on, or John's listed.
Okay. Well,
yeah, he's on. If he'd like to speak, he can raise his hand so I can unmute him.
14 to 17
I see Scott Brandenburg has a question. Is it all right if I unmute him for him to answer?
Yeah.
All right, there we go.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right, wonderful presentation, Christine. I really enjoyed it. It's really interesting that these sites are predicted to have, the shaking would have exceeded the strength, but there was no manifestation.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering whether you looked at the rate with which shear strains were accumulating in your triaxial tests, because I know for sand, under stress-controlled cyclic loading, there's almost nothing, and then all of a sudden you get all this strain happening, whereas for fine-grained soils, it's often more gradual. So I'm just wondering if that feature may have an impact on whether or not there are manifestations when the cyclic strength gets exceeded during shaking.
Yes, we did. And let me share again. I think I can. Okay, can you see this slide?
Yes.
Okay, yes. So we did look at that. We found that it was closer to sort of sand type response for the silty soils that we were looking at, rather than sort of the fatter, slower accumulation overall. It wasn't quite like with the clean sand where it just all of a sudden blows up at once, but we did find in general that it was closer to sand type response.
But, looking at that axial strain versus number of cycles plot, it looks almost like the peak strain and the negatives are kind of linear,
Yeah.
Whereas, sand would be like almost nothing, and then all of a sudden it blows up. So did you notice a difference in this response at the sites that did have surface evidence compared to ones that didn't?
Not in the first, no, in the first couple of cycles, not as clear cut. So let me think. Yes, there's some difference, but that wasn't really one of the things it was more gradual, I guess. More gradual than the sand, but not excessively so, if that answers your question.
Yeah, so they all kind of accumulated strain in a similar manner.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah, and we actually, one of our journal papers, we looked at in the first, I think maybe it was the first, we show a figure that has the first cycle, maybe the first couple of cycles, and then we show snapshots of those comparisons for a sand site and then for a non-plastic silt and a low plasticity silt. So I'd have to look back at that to confirm, but we did show that in one of our figures that did not make it into this presentation.
All right. Thanks.
Sure.
All right, I see. Yes, Armin also has a question. Let me just give him an opportunity to answer or to ask a question.
And I think just for a clarification on your question, Scott, from John, just talking about that loose sand did have that dramatic increase in strain, but dense sand not so much, and the non-plastic silts were responding more like a dense sand. I don't know if everyone saw that in the chat.
Thanks for bringing that up.
Hi, Zee. Thanks for the talk. It's always great to see your work being presented. Really appreciate it. Great talk.
Thanks.
Question for you. Given that these were swamp deposits, one of the things I've always wondered about is off-gassing due to decay of potential organics, particularly given the layered profiles that exist there. And there wasn't probably time to present some of the VP profiles that you had there, but I was curious about the degree of saturation in some of these thin zones. And then
Armin? Can any?
As
That was
well.
awesome.
Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you just fine,
Armin,
Christine. Yeah, I just.
Armin, I think you were asking about partial saturation. I won't try to guess your question. So if the audio comes back, feel free to jump in. But partial saturation, we were working with Ken and Brady, and they did the VP testing at these sites. And so we were able to get VS and VP profiles at these sites that allowed us to see maybe where those zones of partial saturation might be. And we also looked at, in those zones of, quote, partial saturation, where we looked at what the P wave velocities were, and then we compared that with, to see sort of how that, there's a lot of great testing from Tsukamoto and other researchers in Japan about how partial saturation affects cyclic resistance. And so we did look at that, and for some of the zones of partial saturation, we found that just looking at that factor alone, say if the P wave velocity was 900 instead of 1500, that the change in the estimated resistance, it wasn't, that single factor wasn't increasing the resistance to the point that it basically explained the overprediction. Is Armin back, possibly?
I'm not sure if my audio is back. I attempted to.
Oh, you're back.
You typed in.
Okay.
I attempted to put my question in the chat there. That might be better, and I'll just go back on mute. Thanks for responding. Appreciate it, Z.
Yeah, I don't see his question.
In the chat. He said, essentially, I was wondering if your triaxial specimens were partially saturated prior to placement within the triaxial apparatus and what that effect might have been on your CRR N curve.
Yes, they definitely were not fully saturated when we took them out of the ground or when we put them in the tubes, because we allowed the tubes to drain before we cut them and extruded them. However, we did go through back pressure saturation to make sure they got fully saturated before we ran the test.
Great.
So I guess that other explanation was just
looking to see if anyone else has a question.
Extraneous.
No worries. All right, I see. I saw John Stewart's hand would go up barely before Lori Bays. So let's have John go first, and then I'll get Lori in.
Yes, great job, Christine. Really appreciate you're doing that for us. My question is a follow-up to Scott. So I think in your testing, you were describing you tested a range of silts, and some of them had measurable plasticity and some did not, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, did you see differences in the responses, whether it was pore pressure response, the rate of strain accumulation, the fatness of the loops, any of those kinds of things? If you compare the more plastic specimens, which I think had up to like PI of 4 or something, if I read correctly, with the non-plastic ones.
Yes. So we had specimens, they actually, because of the nature of these sites, the specimens ranged, even at the silty soil sites, we did have some sand layers. So they ranged essentially from sand all the way to PI maybe 10 was our maximum. And within those, we didn't see, it was much more of a gradual difference. So it's not like we saw in the PI 10 loops that they were, much fatter than the others. They actually were relatively similar to the lower PI soils. Let me see if I can actually, if you're interested, let me see if I can bring up that figure.
The pore pressure response would be interesting too. Like, do you get to as high of an RU?
No, the pore pressure, yeah, we definitely noticed a difference in the pore pressure response for sure. Yeah, especially when comparing with our with the sands, and that's why for a lot of our for our sand testing and for some of our calibration testing, we were doing it at t equals 10 seconds, but for our overall testing, we ended up doing it at t equals 1 second, and then in that case, of course, we didn't see the same sort of pore to pressure equilibration. Let me see if I can find that. Am I sharing my screen right now?
No.
Okay, let me see if I can find that paper, just because I think that's exactly what you're asking. I didn't want to go over time, but here, let me do this. Okay. There. Screen 2. Okay. So probably should have included these figures. But so this is the pore to pressure response that we observed, and this is the PI equals 10.
Is that the top one?
PI equals 10 is the bottom one. Yeah, and this is a sand. Yeah. So this was the biggest difference that we observed among our set of testing.
Right. Yeah.
And then this, I think maybe going back to Scott's questions, this is showing I believe this was a clean sand. Looking at a lot of things. Yes, clean sand, PI equals 0, PI equals 10, PI equals 10. Okay, yeah. Did we have one other figure? Yeah.
So this is a published paper?
Yeah, this is, so we have three papers that sort of came out of my dissertation for this. This is the paper that specifically focuses on the laboratory testing and gets into all the details about and then here you can see the P-wave velocity testing compared with our Bender element testing of the laboratory specimens and regional VS correlation. So this gets into sort of all the nitty-gritty on the laboratory testing data. And this is in soil dynamics and earthquake engineering. So these are those SEM photos I showed. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. No worries. I can send this to you if you want to. Or if it's, I think it should be, you have those subscriptions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Has a question, so I'm going to give her a chance to ask as soon as I can. All right, you should be unmuted. Lori, are you there? I don't hear any audio from you. I still don't hear anything, but I think I see that you came unmuted.
Maybe type the question.
Right. If you're able to just type something in the chat or in the Q&A, Lori, that might help. And then hopefully the audio will come back.
Going once, going twice.
Feel free to email me afterwards too.
An excellent suggestion.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any questions while we're online?
I don't think I put my contact info there, but I'm sure it's easily accessible online for anyone who doesn't have it.
Right. I think I see her question now. Maybe.
Oh, too hard to type. No problem.
No problem. We'll hopefully get in touch at a later date so we can get any remaining questions answered. I think that's the end of our time, unless you have any final thoughts from our panel.
Just thank you all again for inviting me to share this data with the group today. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Christine. It was a very excellent presentation. We all enjoyed it and very educational. Some great work and a great presentation. Thanks again.